Let me tell you something about the Galactic Military Academy's elite training program. In my 43 cycles as Quartermaster A, I have watched exactly 7,412 recruits walk through those reinforced titanium doors. Most of them, well, let's just say they walked back out a lot faster than they walked in. The name's Quartermaster A, by the way. Not very creative, I know, but when you have 4 arms and a species designation that sounds like someone gargling gravel, simplicity becomes a virtue. I'm Vorthak, which means I'm built like a tank, have the personality of a rusted bolt, and I've seen enough military hopefuls to fill a small moon. So there I was, standing in the primary assessment bay, watching another batch of fresh meat recruits file in for orientation. The usual suspects were already making their presence known. 3 Craxi warriors, each standing 9 feet tall with enough muscle mass to crush a hovercar, were flexing and posturing near the equipment racks. Their leader, some pompous fool who probably had his rank bought by daddy, kept scanning the room like he owned the place. The Zenthari twins, Moran and Mortin, were doing that creepy synchronized movement thing their species loves so much. 6 arms each, moving in perfect harmony, while they assembled some complex training device. Show off. The Morphians were there too, their blue-tinted skin catching the harsh fluorescent lights as they meditated in that annoyingly serene way of theirs. Then she walked in. Amy Kowalski. 5 feet, 4 inches of absolutely nothing special, brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, regulation uniform that looked like it had been tailored for someone twice her size, and the kind of quiet demeanor that screams easy target in 12 different galactic languages. Commander Tom Marley, our head instructor and fellow Vorthak, barely glanced up from his datapad when she entered. Now Tom's what you'd call old-school military. 300 pounds of disciplined muscle, a voice that could shatter glass, and absolutely zero patience for what he considers inferior specimens. The fact that he didn't even acknowledge Amy's entrance should have been my first clue that this was going to be interesting. Line up for initial assessments. Tom's voice boomed across the training bay, causing a few of the more sensitive species to wince. Today we separate the warriors from the waste of oxygen. Amy found herself squeezed between a massive Craxi and Brandon Torres, another human who had arrived the previous week. Now Brandon, he was everything the Academy usually expected from human recruits. 6 feet tall, built like he'd been pumped full of steroids since birth, with that cocky swagger that screamed, "I've been lifting weights since I could walk." He looked down at Amy with the kind of smirk that made me want to punch him with all 4 arms. "Hey there, little lady," he said, loud enough for half the bay to hear. "You sure you're in the right place? The civilian transport leaves in an hour." A few chuckles rippled through the group. The Craxi warriors exchanged amused glances, their translator devices picking up the mockery and converting it into their native tongue. Even some of the more reserved species seemed to be suppressing what passed for laughter in their cultures. Amy said nothing, just stood there, eyes forward, hands clasped behind her back in perfect military posture. But I caught something the others missed. A tiny muscle twitch in her jaw. Girl had steel in her, even if nobody else could see it. "All right, maggots." Commander Marley's voice cut through the chatter like a plasma blade through butter. "First assessment is basic physical capability. We're going to see what kind of raw material we're working with here." He gestured toward a series of exercise stations designed to test various aspects of physical prowess. Strength, agility, endurance, reaction time. The work. All calibrated for the average galactic species, which meant they were built for beings considerably larger and stronger than your typical human. "Torres," Marley barked. "You're up first. Show us what Earth's finest has to offer." Brandon practically strutted to the first station, a grip strength tester that looked like it belonged in a medieval torture chamber. He grabbed the handles, flexed every visible muscle, and squeezed with everything he had. The digital readout flashed an impressive score that had the other recruits nodding with grudging respect. "Not bad for a human," one of the Craxi muttered. When it was Amy's turn, the snickering started before she even reached the machine. The handles were sized for beings with significantly larger hands, and she had to stretch her fingers just to get a proper grip. Her score was, well, let's just say it wouldn't have impressed a Morphean child. Maybe kitchen duty would be more your speed, Brandon called out, earning another round of chuckles. That's when I knew this was going to be a very long day. Warm-ups begin in 5 minutes, Commander Marley announced, his voice echoing off the metallic walls like a death sentence. And let me remind you pathetic excuses for military personnel that this academy maintains a graduation rate of exactly 3.2%. Most of you will be gone before the week is out. Now when Marley says warm-ups, what he really means is let's see who breaks first. These exercises weren't designed by some committee of fitness experts. Oh no, they were crafted by sadistic military minds who believed that if you couldn't handle the warm-up, you had absolutely no business pretending to be a galactic defender. The first station was something the Academy lovingly called gravitational resistance training, fancy name for lifting increasingly heavy weights, while artificial gravity generators made everything feel like you were stuck in molasses. The starting weight? 200 pounds. For context, that's what your average Morphean uses as a paperweight. Amy stepped up to the platform, and I swear I heard someone in the back actually giggle. The barbell looked like it could serve as a support beam for a small building. She wrapped her hands around the grip, and for a moment nothing happened. The weight didn't budge, not even a millimeter. "Come on, human," shouted Judge Quintara, a particularly obnoxious Craxi, who served as one of our evaluators. His voice carried that special kind of condescension that only comes from generations of genetic superiority complex. My grandmother could lift that, and she's been dead for 60 cycles. The twins, Moran and Morting, started that synchronized whisper laughing thing that Zenthari do when they find something particularly amusing. 6 arms each moving in perfect harmony, as they pointed at Amy's futile attempts to move the barbell. 10 credits says she quits before station 3, Moran whispered to his brother. Too generous, Mortin replied. 5 credits says she doesn't make it past this one. Brandon Torres was already at station 4, having breezed through the first 3 with the kind of ease that made everyone forget he was still human. Hey Amy, he called out between his own exercises. There's no shame in admitting you're out of your league. Maybe try the administrative track. But here's the thing about Amy Kowalski that nobody seemed to notice. While everyone else was showing off, flexing and generally making spectacles of themselves, she was watching, learning, analyzing every movement, every technique, every tiny detail that might give her an edge. She adjusted her stance, changed her grip, and tried again. This time, the barbell moved. Not much, barely enough to notice, but it moved. She managed 3 repetitions before her arms gave out completely, while the Craxi beside her was casually pressing twice that weight with one hand. Pathetic, Judge Quintara announced loud enough for the entire bay to hear. I've seen more impressive displays of strength from newborn larvae. Station 2 was the multi-directional agility course. Think obstacle course meets sadistic playground equipment designed by someone who clearly had issues with childhood. Rotating beams, swinging pendulums, platforms that shifted without warning, all while maintaining perfect balance and hitting target switches along the way. The course was calibrated for beings with multiple limbs, enhanced reflexes, and center of gravity calculations that made sense for species who didn't evolve from tree-climbing primates. Amy managed to navigate maybe 30% of it before a swinging pendulum knocked her clean off a rotating beam and sent her tumbling onto the safety mats below. Ouch, commented one of the Morpheans with what I can only describe as polite sympathy. That looked uncomfortable. Uncomfortable. Brandon laughed as he effortlessly swung from beam to beam like some kind of athletic monkey. That looked embarrassing. The betting pool was growing. I overheard at least 6 different wagers on exactly when Amy would wash out. The most optimistic gave her until lunch. The pessimists were betting she'd be gone within the hour. Station 3 was cardiovascular endurance testing. Treadmills that could simulate running conditions on 17 different planetary surfaces, from the heavy gravity of Craxi Prime to the low-oxygen mountain ranges of Zenthari homeworld. The goal was to maintain peak performance for 20 minutes across varying conditions. Amy lasted exactly 12 minutes and 43 seconds before her legs gave out completely. She collapsed onto the moving belt and had to be helped off by 2 medical assistants. Meanwhile, the Craxi warriors were treating it like a casual jog, barely breaking what passed for sweat in their species. "This is just sad," Judge Quintara proclaimed, making notes on his datapad with theatrical gestures. "Command is going to want to know how this specimen even made it through preliminary selection. But you know what I noticed? Amy never complained. Not once. She got knocked down, she got back up. She failed an exercise, she moved to the next one, while everyone else was trash-talking or showing off or making excuses for their own performances. She just kept going. There was something almost mechanical about her persistence, like watching a broken droid trying to complete its programming despite obvious system failures. It should have been pitiful, but there was something oddly admirable about it too. I give her points for stubbornness," Commander Marley muttered to me, as we watched Amy attempt Station 4. "But stubbornness doesn't win wars." Station 4 nearly finished her off completely. Combat simulation sparring against holographic opponents programmed to match various alien fighting styles. Amy got absolutely demolished by a virtual Craxi warrior in roughly 15 seconds. The hologram didn't even need to use advanced techniques. Basic punches and kicks were more than sufficient to send her flying. By the time warm-ups were officially over, Amy looked like she'd been run over by a cargo transport, twice. Her uniform was soaked with sweat, her hair had escaped from its ponytail, and she was breathing like she'd just sprinted up a mountain. The other recruits were already moving toward the main training area, chattering excitedly about the real exercises to come. Amy was still sitting on the floor, trying to catch her breath. "You know what, kid?" I found myself saying as I approached her. "You might want to consider that administrative track Brandon mentioned." She looked up at me with those quiet brown eyes and said something that stopped me cold. "Respectfully, Quartermaster O. I didn't come here to quit." 20 minutes later we were all standing outside the emergency response simulation chamber, which sounds impressive until you realize it's basically a giant metal box designed to test how well you perform under pressure when everything is going wrong. And in the Academy's infinite wisdom, everything going wrong usually meant people are dying while you figure out how to save them. The chamber itself was a marvel of sadistic engineering. 300 feet long, 100 feet wide, with adjustable environmental controls that could simulate everything, from hull breaches in deep space to toxic atmosphere rescues on hostile planets. Today's scenario was what the Academy called a standard emergency response situation, which in military speak translates to prepare for nightmare fuel. Standing beside the entrance was Admiral Vashi, a decorated Morphean war hero whose blue-tinted skin bore the distinctive scars of someone who'd seen actual combat. Unlike the rest of us, Vashi didn't need to prove anything to anyone. 3 tours of duty in the Outer Rim conflicts, 2 commendations for valor under fire, and a reputation that made seasoned veterans nervous just being in the same room. "Listen up, recruits." Admiral Vashi's voice carried the kind of authority that came from years of making life or death decisions. "Today's exercise is simple in concept, brutal in execution. Emergency distress call from a damaged research station. Hull breach in Sector 7 has trapped 15 scientists behind a compromised airlock. Your job is to reach them before their oxygen runs out." He gestured toward the chamber's main entrance, where we could see the massive airlock door that served as the primary obstacle. The thing was easily 8 feet tall and 6 feet wide, made of reinforced durasteel with emergency locking mechanisms that had been deliberately damaged for the simulation. "The door's power systems are offline," Vashi continued, his tone completely matter-of-fact. "Manual override is jammed. The only way through is brute force. You have exactly 18 minutes before the simulated casualties suffocate. Timer starts the moment you enter the chamber." Commander Marley stepped forward, his forearms crossed in what I'd learned was his time to separate the weak from the strong pose. "I want our 6 strongest candidates on this exercise. The rest of you will observe and learn." The selection was obvious. 3 Craxi warriors, including the son of General Kraftnog himself, a pompous specimen named Zephyr, who'd been bragging about his lineage since he arrived. 2 Zenthari brothers, not the twins from earlier, but equally muscled specimens named Thok and Grak. And bringing up the rear, Brandon Torres, who'd been selected as the token human representative. Amy stood with the rest of us observers, still looking like she'd been through a meat grinder, but her eyes were focused intently on the door. I noticed she was studying its construction, the way the locking mechanisms were positioned, the stress points where the damage had occurred. "Begin exercise," Admiral Vashi announced, and immediately the chamber filled with flashing red lights and the kind of alarm sounds that make your blood pressure spike. The 6 selected recruits charged toward the door with all the subtlety of a meteor strike. Zephyr Krathnog took point, his massive Kraxi frame dwarfing even the oversized entrance. "Stand back, inferiors," he bellowed with the kind of arrogance that made me want to slap him with all 4 arms. "Krafnog's strength will open this barrier." He grabbed the door's manual release handles and pulled with everything he had. The muscles in his arms bulged, his face turned an alarming shade of purple, and absolutely nothing happened. The door didn't budge even a millimeter. "Allow me," said Thuk, one of the Zenthari brothers. "Perhaps multiple contact points will provide better leverage." Both brothers positioned themselves at different points along the door, their combined 12 arms providing what should have been overwhelming force. They coordinated their efforts, pulled in perfect synchronization, and achieved exactly the same result as Zephyr. Nothing. Meanwhile, the simulation timer was ticking away with all the cheerful persistence of a funeral march. 14 minutes remaining. Somewhere behind that door 15 virtual scientists were slowly running out of air, while we watched 6 of the Academy's finest struggle with basic problem solving. "Torres," Commander Marley barked, "show them how humans handle obstacles." Brandon stepped forward with that same cocky swagger he'd displayed all day. "Leave this to someone with actual brains," he announced, then proceeded to attempt the exact same brute force approach that had already failed twice. 12 minutes remaining. The alarm sounds were getting more insistent, and I could see sweat starting to form on Admiral Vashi's forehead. This wasn't going according to plan. These 6 recruits represented the absolute peak of physical capability among the current class, and they were failing at what should have been a straightforward strength exercise. "All together," Zephyr commanded, his military training finally overriding his ego. "Coordinated effort on my mark." All 6 recruits positioned themselves around the door, grabbing whatever handholds they could find. 18 arms, over 2,000 pounds of combined muscle mass, and enough raw strength to probably lift a small shuttle. They pulled with everything they had. The door groaned. Metal stressed against metal. For a moment it looked like they might actually succeed. Then the handles they were gripping started to bend under the pressure. "Stop!" Admiral Vashi shouted. "You're damaging the equipment." 10 minutes remaining. The casualty counter on the simulation display was starting to climb as the virtual scientists began succumbing to oxygen deprivation. 1 down, then 2. The exercise was turning into a disaster. "Sir?" Amy Kowalski's voice cut through the chaos like a plasma blade through tissue paper. She'd stepped forward from the observer group, her hand raised in a tentative gesture. "Permission to attempt the door, sir." The chamber fell silent except for the blaring alarms. Judge Quintara actually laughed out loud. "The human child thinks she can succeed where our strongest warriors have failed." "Amy," Brandon called out, wiping sweat from his forehead, "this isn't the time for heroics. This door needs serious muscle." Commander Marley looked like he was about to dismiss her outright, but Admiral Vashi held up a hand. 8 minutes remaining, he said quietly. "At this point, I'm willing to try anything." Amy nodded and walked toward the door, while 18 sets of alien eyes watched her with expressions ranging from amusement to outright disbelief. That's when things got interesting. Amy approached the door with the kind of methodical calm that made everyone nervous. While the 6 strongest recruits had charged at it like berserkers, she moved like a technician approaching a delicate piece of equipment. Her eyes weren't focused on the handles or the obvious grip points. Instead, she was studying the hinges, the frame, the way the damaged locking mechanism had twisted during the simulated emergency. 7 minutes remaining. Admiral Vashi announced, his voice tight with tension. "What is she doing?" Judge Quintara muttered, his massive Kraxi frame shifting with impatience. "The door requires force, Not whatever this is. Amy was now running her hands along the doorframe, feeling for something the rest of us couldn't see. Her fingers traced the edges where the metal had been bent, following stress fractures that were barely visible to the naked eye. She stepped back, tilted her head and stared at the door like it was a puzzle she was determined to solve. "Amy," Brandon called out, his voice carrying a mix of frustration and concern. "We don't have time for analysis, just grab the handles and pull." She ignored him completely. Instead, she walked to a nearby supply rack and retrieved a piece of metal piping that had been left over from some previous exercise. About 4 feet long, maybe an inch in diameter. To everyone watching, it looked like she was preparing to use it as some kind of prying tool. "The small human intends to use leverage," observed Moran, one of the Zenthari twins. "Primitive technique, but theoretically sound." "Theoretically useless," his brother Morting corrected. "The force required exceeds what any single being can generate, regardless of mechanical advantage." 6 minutes remaining. Another virtual casualty appeared on the display. The simulation was becoming a massacre while we watched Amy position her makeshift lever against what appeared to be a completely random spot on the doorframe. That's when Admiral Drahorn arrived. I hadn't seen him enter, but suddenly he was there, standing beside Admiral Vashi, with the kind of presence that made everyone unconsciously stand up straighter. Drahorn was old-school military, a Vorthik like myself, but with twice the experience and none of my charming personality. He'd been running war games when most of us were still figuring out which end of a plasma rifle was dangerous. "What exactly is happening here?" Drahorn's voice could have cut through armor plating. "Emergency response exercise, sir," Admiral Vashi replied. "Door mechanism failure. We're experiencing some difficulties." Drahorn's 4 eyes swept the scene, taking in the 6 exhausted recruits, the undamaged door, and Amy Kowalski positioning her metal pipe with the precision of a surgeon. "That small human is attempting to open a door that 6 of our strongest candidates could not move." "Yes, sir." "Interesting." Amy had found her position now. The metal pipe was wedged against a specific point on the doorframe, angled in a way that looked completely wrong to everyone watching. She wasn't trying to pry the door open. She wasn't attacking the handles or the locking mechanism. Instead, she had positioned her lever at what appeared to be the most structurally sound part of the entire assembly. 5 minutes. The alarm systems were getting more insistent, and the casualty count was climbing steadily. Commander Marley stepped forward, his patience finally exhausted. "Kowalski, either open that door or step aside and let someone competent handle this." Amy looked up at him with those quiet brown eyes and said, "Sir, with respect, everyone else has been trying to force the door to open against its damaged locking mechanism. But the mechanism isn't what's keeping it closed." "Explain," Admiral Drahorn commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "The emergency damage simulation bent the doorframe, sir. The door isn't locked, it's jammed. The locking mechanism is irrelevant. The frame needs to be realigned before the door can move." She adjusted her grip on the metal pipe, positioning herself at an angle that looked like it would provide minimal leverage and maximum inefficiency. Everyone watching could see that this was going to be a spectacular failure. 4 minutes remaining. "This is ridiculous," Zephyr Krufnog announced. "A human child cannot possibly." Amy pushed down on her lever. The door moved. Not the grinding, straining movement that the 6 strongest recruits had managed after enormous effort. This was smooth, almost effortless motion. The door swung open like it had been designed to do exactly that, revealing the simulated emergency chamber beyond. The silence that followed was so complete that the only sounds were the emergency alarms and the distant hum of the facility's environmental systems. How Brandon Torres stared at the open door like it had personally offended him. "That's impossible. We tried everything." "You tried brute force," Amy replied, setting down her makeshift lever with the same careful precision she'd used to position it. "But the problem wasn't strength. It was understanding why the door was stuck in the first place." Admiral Drahorn stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Explain, now." Amy gestured toward the door frame, pointing out stress fractures that suddenly seemed obvious now that someone had mentioned them. The simulation damaged the frame here and here, causing it to compress inward. The door wasn't locked, it was physically unable to move because the frame was pinching it shut. Applying force to the handles just made the problem worse by increasing the pressure. So Admiral Vashi's voice trailed off as he processed what he was seeing. I used the lever to flex the frame back to its original position. Once the door was no longer being pinched, it opened normally. The casualty simulation timer showed 3 minutes and 47 seconds remaining. Amy had not only solved the problem, she'd done it with time to spare. Commander Marley was staring at the door like it had grown tentacles. Judge Quintara was making notes on his datapad with the frantic energy of someone trying to document something he didn't understand. The 6 recruited strongmen were standing around looking like they'd just watched someone violate several laws of physics. Outstanding, Admiral Drahorn said quietly. Then, louder, someone explained to me how our assessment protocols failed to identify this level of tactical thinking. That's when the real scrambling began. You want to know the truth about humans? Here's what 43 cycles of military experience taught me that day. Every other species in the galaxy evolved with advantages. The Kraxi got size and strength. The Zenthuri got multiple limbs and coordination. The Morphians got enhanced reflexes and tactical awareness. Humans got the short end of every evolutionary stick, so they learned to make tools. And when you spend 200,000 years figuring out how to move boulders with sticks and leverage because you're too weak to move them with muscle, you develop a very different approach to problem solving. It's basic physics, Amy was explaining to Admiral Drahorn, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone who couldn't understand why this was such a big deal. Force times distance equals work. If you can't increase the force, you increase the distance. The lever gave me approximately a 4-to-1 mechanical advantage, and positioning it to flex the frame rather than fight the locking mechanism meant I was working with the door's design instead of against it. Admiral Drahorn nodded slowly, like he was processing information that fundamentally challenged everything he thought he knew about capability assessment. And you determined this how? I looked at it, sir. The stress fractures showed where the frame had compressed. The door's position showed it was binding against the frame rather than the locks. Once you know what the actual problem is, the solution becomes obvious. Commander Marley was having what I can only describe as an existential crisis. Our entire assessment protocol is based on direct physical capability measurements, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. We test strength, endurance, speed, combat prowess, but not problem solving under pressure. Admiral Vashi finished. Not tactical analysis, not the ability to see solutions that aren't immediately obvious. I watched the other recruits processing this revelation, and the shift in their attitudes was something to behold. Judge Quintara had stopped making sarcastic comments and was actually studying Amy like she was some kind of fascinating new species. The Zenthuri twins were whispering to each other in rapid-fire synchronization, probably recalculating their assumptions about human capabilities. Most interesting was Brandon Torres. The cocky swagger was completely gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine respect mixed with no small amount of embarrassment. He approached Amy with the careful steps of someone who'd just realized they'd been making a fool of themselves. "Amy," he said, his voice lacking any of the condescension that had colored it earlier. "I owe you an apology. That was brilliant." Amy looked up at him with that same quiet expression she'd maintained all day. "It was just problem-solving, Brandon. Nothing special." "Nothing special?" Zephyr Krafnog's voice carried a note of wonder that was completely at odds with his earlier arrogance. "You accomplished in minutes what the 6 of us could not do at all. You were trying to force a door that couldn't be forced," Amy replied matter-of-factly. "I just paid attention to why it couldn't be forced and worked around that instead. And that, right there, is humanity in a nutshell. When they can't go through something, they go around it. When they can't lift something, they find a lever. When they can't win by being stronger, they win by being smarter." The Academy's assessment protocols were about to get a very serious overhaul. 6 months later, Amy Kowalski graduated 3rd in her class, not because she'd suddenly developed superhuman strength or grown an extra pair of arms, but because the Academy had finally figured out how to properly evaluate what she brought to the table. Problem solving, adaptive thinking, and the kind of stubborn refusal to accept that impossible actually means impossible. She's serving on Admiral Vashi's flagship now, and from what I hear, she's already revolutionized their emergency response protocols. Something about working smarter, not harder, which apparently is a human saying that roughly translates to, there's always an easier way if you're clever enough to find it. Brandon Torres graduated right beside her, by the way. Turns out he learned more from watching Amy solve that door problem than he had from months of traditional training. They make a good team now, strength and strategy working together instead of competing. As for me, well, I've been reassigned to develop new assessment criteria for human recruits. Turns out when you spend your entire evolutionary history being too weak to solve problems with brute force, you get really, really good at finding alternatives. I can't wait to see what other impossible things the next batch of humans will make look easy. Something tells me we haven't seen anything yet.